In the silent expanse of space, over 200,000 miles from Earth, disaster struck when an explosion crippled Apollo 13's systems.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
3 astronauts were left stranded in their compromised spaceship, battling for survival with dwindling oxygen, limited power, and no clear path home. As the world watched in stunned silence, NASA raced against time to save its crew. What was meant to be a lunar mission became a testament to human ingenuity and teamwork. It forever changed the way spaceflight would be approached, ushering in new safety protocols and technological advancements. This is the story of Apollo 13.
Carbon dioxide levels in the lunar module are rising.
The main heat shield was not designed to operate in free space for extended periods of time.
The crew were beginning to suffer. It was a dire state. It was a real emergency situation.
NASA's Apollo missions began with the tragedy of Apollo 1 in February of 1967, but the program remained committed to JFK's vision of landing humans on the moon. After 4 more successful crewed missions to practice the launch and approach a full moon landing, NASA and their astronauts were ready for the real thing. On July 20th, 1969, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong made history, becoming the very first humans to set foot upon the surface of our closest celestial neighbor.
Slam now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
From that moment, the Apollo program continued manned missions to gather data and advance spaceflight. What once seemed impossible was becoming almost business as usual. And then came Apollo 13. After Apollo 11 achieved the first successful manned landing on the moon, Apollo 12 followed up with a focus on perfecting the precision of lunar landings. Now, Apollo 13's intended purpose was to explore an area called the Fra Mauro Highlands, collecting scientific samples and placing the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, also known as ALSEP. This included a variety of scientific instruments designed to gather data on the moon's environment and geology. The crew of Apollo 13 was a well-prepared team with a range of experience. Jim Lovell, the mission commander, was a veteran astronaut with 3 prior spaceflights, including the Apollo 8 mission, the first mission to orbit the moon. Fred Haise, the lunar module pilot, though on his first spaceflight, was an experienced test pilot with a calm demeanor. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, was a last-minute replacement for Ken Mattingly, who had been removed from the mission due to a German measles exposure. While Apollo 13 was Swigert's first flight, his engineering background and years of training as a backup astronaut had prepared him to adapt quickly. Together, Lovell's leadership, Haise's pilot abilities, and Swigert's technical expertise formed an exceptionally talented crew. On April 11, 1970, the men arrived at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert, strapped into the Saturn V rocket. They sat there waiting for the familiar rumble of liftoff, the culmination of years and years of training. The launch went off without a hitch, and Apollo 13 soon began its journey to the moon. The first 2 days of the mission were relatively smooth. The crew was en route to the moon and spirits were high. But at 55 hours, 54 minutes into the mission, just under 200,000 miles from Earth, the emergency began. In the vacuum of space, the crew heard a loud bang. A moment later, their onboard instruments started flashing alarming readings. One of the oxygen tanks had exploded. Swigert radioed mission control with the now famous words,
Had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
At first, there was confusion. The flight controllers didn't know what to make of the garbled information coming from Apollo 13. But as the details came in, it became horrifyingly clear. Their spacecraft was in serious trouble. One of the oxygen tanks had been destroyed, and the second tank was leaking fast. Oxygen wasn't just for breathing. It powered the fuel cells that generated the electricity. Without it, they wouldn't just run out of air. The entire spacecraft would shut down. On Earth, the mission was declared an emergency. NASA's sole goal became getting these men back alive. As word of the unfolding crisis spread, news stations across the globe scrambled to cover the story. Television networks broke into regular programming with live updates, and radio stations broadcast urgent bulletins as details trickled in from NASA's mission control. Anchors spoke in hushed, anxious tones, relaying the latest information while experts speculated on the crew's chances of survival. Viewers around the world gathered around their TVs, glued to the screen as the gravity of the situation became clear. The astronauts were stranded nearly 200,000 miles from home in a spacecraft that was running out of oxygen and power, and the fate of Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert hung in the balance. The damage to the command module was catastrophic, but NASA had one ace up its sleeve. The lunar module, intended for landing on the moon, was still functional. With quick thinking, the engineers in Houston realized they could use the lunar module, nicknamed Aquarius, as a lifeboat. The lunar module was designed to support 2 men for about 2 days, not 3 men for 4 days. Lovell, Haise, and Swigert immediately began shutting down the command module to conserve power necessary for a re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. All non-essential systems were turned off, leaving only the most crucial life support systems running in the lunar module. They would have to endure extreme cold, limited food, and only the faint hope of making it back alive. Back on Earth, a massive team of NASA engineers scrambled to figure out how to bring the astronauts home. Every calculation had to be perfect. A single misstep could send the spacecraft careening off into deep space or burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. There was also the problem of navigation. With the command module powered down, the astronauts couldn't rely on their navigation computers. To make matters worse, the explosion had blown the spacecraft off course, meaning they would miss Earth entirely if they didn't correct their trajectory. And finally, the explosion had scattered debris all around the spacecraft, creating a cloud of particles that obscured their view of the stars, which normally could have been used for manual navigation. The crew would have to execute a critical burn, using the lunar module's engine to get back on course. But without a functional guidance system, they were forced to improvise, using nothing more than a mechanical sight and their shrouded view of Earth through a window to navigate. To correct their trajectory, they needed to perform a series of engine burns without computer assistance. The slightest miscalculation in either the timing or duration of the thrust would alter their path significantly. Everything was done manually, guided by instinct and experience. Jim Lovell used the mechanical sight to keep the Earth in view, while Jack Swigert controlled the thruster, needing exact timing to nudge the spacecraft back on course. Without the ship's electrical components, Swigert had to rely on his Speedmaster watch to time the burns needed to get them into the correct approach path. If their manual course correction had been even slightly off, the spacecraft could have either missed Earth entirely, sending them drifting helplessly into the cold, infinite expanse of space, or they would have re-entered the atmosphere at too steep of an angle, causing them to burn up on descent. As Apollo 13 neared Earth, new problems arose. The astronauts were running out of water and power. The lunar module's battery reserves, which were never designed to last this long, were draining fast. On top of that, CO2 levels were rising dangerously quickly. The CO2 problem could have killed the astronauts before anything else. The lunar module's filters weren't designed to handle the output of 3 astronauts for this length of time. Back at the Houston Mission Control Center, engineers quickly came up with a solution, jerry-rigging a makeshift air filter from materials on board, including a plastic bag, duct tape, and a sock. The crew could now breathe easier as CO2 levels were stabilized, but there were still countless unknowns, and no one knew whether the spacecraft's systems would hold out long enough for a safe re-entry. On April 17, 1970, 6 days after launch, the crew of Apollo 13 prepared for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, and the series of actions during these next few minutes would be the final determinant whether they lived or died. A final 14-second burn was needed to get the right angle of approach. With a manual sight and his Speedmaster watch to count the seconds, Swigert successfully nudged the ship into course. With the course correction complete, the crew continued focusing on the next critical challenge for re-entry. One by one, the astronauts made their way out of the lunar module and back into the command module, which had been dormant for days, saving for this final stretch, and they powered it up. Although the team had masterfully maneuvered their ship into the correct angle of approach, the heat shield on the module had been exposed to debris from the explosion, and no one knew whether it would withstand the heat of re-entry. Lovell, Haise, and Swigert sat in silence as the module hurtled towards Earth at 24,000 miles per hour. Below them, the global audience watched and waited. As the spacecraft hit the upper atmosphere, it disappeared into the expected radio blackout, leaving the world in agonizing silence. Normally, the blackout would last just 3 minutes, but as the seconds ticked by, 3 minutes stretched to 4, then 5. The world held its breath. Finally, in a burst of static, the crew's voice broke through.
Oh, Houston, this is Odyssey. It's good to see you again.
The spacecraft had survived re-entry. Apollo 13 splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean near Samoa, where it was recovered by the US Navy. Against all odds, the astronauts were alive and returned to the Earth as heroes. What could have been NASA's greatest disaster instead became one of its greatest triumphs. The ingenuity, bravery, and teamwork of both the astronauts and the thousands of engineers back on Earth ensured that no lives were lost. The mission has been dubbed the successful failure as the life-threatening problems led to advancements in spacecraft design, such as improved oxygen tank insulation, better fault detection systems, and enhanced backup protocols for emergencies. It also led to improved crew training and crisis management, which became central to all future space missions. Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert's near-death experience is remembered as one of the most dramatic stories of survival in history. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments which survival stories you'd like to hear next, and I'll see you in the next one.